Hello, hi everyone. So it's 6:30 in India right now, so I guess it's a good time to begin. Um, Good evening and thank you for joining us today online for the latest talk of our series, Design History Now, hosted by the Bangalore International Center. I'm Adarsh Rajan, an independent Tamil type designer and researcher, and it is my pleasure to introduce Abira's talk, Noori Nastaleeq, Shaping Language and Politics in Everyday Urdu Print Culture. A quick piece of housekeeping. Feel free to post your questions and remarks on the Q&A box at any point throughout the presentation. We will address select questions at the end. And in case you miss it, we will be posting the bios on the chat. Before we begin the talk, a quick recap of the telos of this series that my co-host Nia and I have put together. In short, we want to understand design as a consequence. Pop research in typography and type design tends towards triumphalist narratives of quintessential designers or design thinkers in pursuit of things of aesthetic insight or technological progress. Sure, much of this obsession can be attributed to the preoccupations of the professional designer of today: make things that please and make things that work. However, to limit our understanding of design to these two criteria is to ignore the fact that, first, design is a product of political and social negotiations. Power and labor are the deliberate, invisible, and invisibilized forces that undergird the very material nature of the profession. Second, that these conditions mean that design can have consequences that extend beyond their impact on our visual culture. Therefore, investigating the materiality of design and its life beyond its conception may allow us to glimpse beyond the simplistic, almost mythic narratives peddled by most biographies. More importantly, as we shall see in the talk today, such an examination may poke holes in the nationalist narratives of progress, or that what might on the surface seem like technological progress might in fact reveal the limits of a design and the biases of the designer. Now, our goal here is not meant as a slight against the agents of history or a detraction against any landmark achievements. Instead, it is meant as a request for design researchers to embed their work in a larger context, a way to bridge the yawning gap that exists between history as the messy fact that it is and how we choose to remember it. With this in mind, allow me to introduce you to our speaker. Abira Kamran is a designer, web developer, and typographer. She works between Birmingham, UK and Karachi, Pakistan. She is an AHRC-funded PhD student at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading. Her research investigates the design and technological challenges associated with publishing Urdu in digital devices. Her PhD research is titled Reading Urdu on the Internet, a study of Lahori Nastaliq as a model for enabling digital parity across scripts. And this includes the development of an open source web typographic framework for global scripts. She is also a lecturer in design at the University of Reading. And now over to Abira. I think you're on mute.
Classic mistake. All right, at the beginning. Thanks, Adarsh and Lekha, for having me today. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for everyone for taking out the time to join the webinar. Every time that I speak about the subject, I learn something new, and so I'm really happy and grateful to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, and we can get started. Wonderful. So before I begin, I thought, let me just make a quick introduction. Like, I came to this research not because of any kind of intellectual interest, but mostly because I was a web designer, and a lot of my work spans, as Adarsh mentioned, between the UK and Pakistan. So I was working with research institutes and universities in Pakistan, creating websites for them, and they were doing this amazing groundbreaking research, but inevitably that research was locked in English. And so I, as a web designer, said, no problem, I'll just make you a bilingual website, Urdu and English. And then as I started on that journey, I realized that it's actually quite complicated to typeset anything that is like sophisticated, that has a heading, a caption, body text, any kind of sophisticated document in Urdu, specifically online. And so I thought I'll just ask somebody to help. And it turns out that there's been very little research done on the subject, and there isn't a lot of expertise around. So one thing led to another, and now I'm doing my PhD on this. And so the other important disclaimer is that I have begun my PhD. A lot of this research that I will be speaking with you today is more like a journey that I've just started. And so it's not conclusive findings that I'm sharing with you, but interesting streams of ideas that I'm coming across and exploring as I work on my PhD. One of the stories in my PhD is the story of this font, which is Noori Nastaleeq. And so what is Noori Nastaleeq? Noori Nastaleeq is the single most popular font for writing Urdu in Pakistan. That is what it looks like. Most of you will already know that Urdu is written in the Arabic script style. And so you can see here, I've written Noori Nastaleeq in that font. That's what it looks like. And then secondly, what do I mean when I say print culture? In this talk, I'm referring to print culture in the most largest general form. So any kind of print material, whether it's newspapers or posters or books or pamphlets, any kind of ephemera in the city. Interestingly, nearly all of it is published in Nastaleeq. Now a little bit is changing. We see some other fonts and other script styles come, but it's fair to say that predominantly nearly all of Urdu print culture is predicated on this script style of Nastaleeq. Secondly, you would think that this is hyperbole. Can a single font really have the kind of impact that we will be discussing in today's presentation? And one of the ways, so I made like a poor Venn diagram to explain the scope of the talk. We will be discussing how Noori Nastaleeq, the font, was designed, its relationship to the way Urdu language exists and has evolved over time. Its relationship to the way Urdu is used within technology, whether it's just reading Urdu or coding with Urdu, that kind of stuff. And then importantly, its relationship to a longer trajectory of the expectations of Urdu readers that are informed by calligraphic manuscript expectations. And so we'll be looking at both language, history, and a little bit of technology as well in this, but tying it all together with the anchor of Noori Nastaleeq, which is the font. This is one of the first puzzles I had when I hadn't even begun my research. So if any Urdu reader looks through their bookshelf, you will notice that nearly every single Urdu book in your bookshelf uses only a single font, Noori Nastaleeq, which is extremely surprising, because if you were to do the same survey in English or any of the other languages that you might use, you will see that actually a lot of different kinds of fonts are used. So for example, in a children's book, you will see a different font. In an academic or scientific document, you will see a more severe, more conservative, more traditional font. So there are all these ways that fonts play a role in the kind of content that we consume. But in Urdu, that's not strictly true, because we will use Noori Nastaleeq for virtually everything. And so that's the first kind of surprising clue that I had, that something was up and it's worth investigating. The second clue that I had is when I started looking at the documents in my house. So this is my own nikahnaama, my marriage certificate from 2011. And when I finally looked at it a couple of years ago, I realized that it's actually a handwritten and photocopied document. And so this is an official document of the government of Pakistan, and it is completely handwritten and then photocopied, and this is in 2011. So it's quite surprising that even in 2011, handwritten documents are circulating as part of bureaucracy, as part of just general daily life as well. I mean, there are many other problems with this, with the way the difficulty of reading this kind of document, which we won't get into today, but nevertheless, to 2011, and we still have handwritten documents circulating as official documents. This is a scan of Firozul Lughat, which is a classic Urdu dictionary. You will find this in every single Urdu-speaking, Urdu-reading person's home. This is also a facsimile of a lithographed, handwritten, and then lithographed dictionary from 1985. The first edition is 1985. This edition that I have, I think, is 2015. But again, it's surprising to me that still The dictionary that I use in my home as well is a handwritten and then lithographed and then printed to a digital press document. So what is the reason why the handwritten Nastaliq style is still prevalent in our bookshelves when you would think that that's a much more cumbersome way to produce documents now, cumbersome and expensive? So a little bit of background. Urdu is, of course, one of the many languages spoken in Pakistan. It is not the most spoken language in Pakistan. I think that's Saraiki and then Punjabi, something like that. But globally, it has nearly 62 million native speakers and also even more speakers who speak it as a second language. It is also a very important language in India. 65%, I think, of education in Pakistani schools is in Urdu. So 65% of schools have this as a primary language of instruction. But it is not the most spoken language in Pakistan, but it is the most printed language in Pakistan. So most of any kind of print document that you see in Pakistan will likely be in Urdu, and that's kind of an important distinction that Urdu has. Of course, it's also the official language of government. English and Urdu both in Pakistan are. Urdu is written in the script style of Nastaliq. It is written, Nastaliq is an Arabic script style, and within the Arabic script, you have many different styles. And for all of history, all of these styles have been used for various purposes. So, for example, Kufi is one of the oldest ones. It is a geometric style. It is also quite hard to read, and so it is often used in large inscriptions in architecture, so like mosques and things like that. Divani is a very elaborate, complicated style to read, so it was often used as a style for court communication, because you would have to have learned how to read Divani to read it easily, and so often it was meant only for the Ottoman court communication. Ruqa, for example, is a very popular style used in Egypt. Naskh is a style that often is used for the larger part of the so the Middle East, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, all of these, UAE as well. They'll use Naskh as the predominant style. So all of this to say that depending on the kind of use you have and also the kind of geography you might live in, a different script style might be favored. In Pakistan, we use Nastaliq. That is the most favored style that we have. One of the most interesting things about Nastaliq, and something that I really quite marvel at, and something that I took for granted as a native Urdu reader, is that Nastaliq has a lot of visual diversity and complexity. So by way of explanation, I have put 3 English words here in the center. It says beef, absolute, and slab. Beef, the alphabet B comes in the beginning. In the second word, it comes in the center-ish. And in the last word, slab, it comes right at the very end. But despite the change of position, so beginning, middle, or end, it looks exactly the same. That's not true for Urdu. Depending on where the alphabet is coming in a word, whether it's the beginning, middle, or end, or if it's isolated on its own, it'll have a different visual representation. This is made even more complicated when we realize that it's not just the position that changes the way an Urdu letter alphabet looks. It's also it is also dependent on what is the letter that comes right after it. So here I've made 3 very quick diagrams with the sound b or be in Urdu, and here you can see it's be he, it looks different. Be ye, it looks different, and then be ain looks different. This is just a very quick demonstration of when I say it looks different, I mean it can really look in 14 different ways. So all of the red bits that you can see is when I've just highlighted the alphabet be, and you can see how dramatically different it can look. It can look both like much more elongated with the second here be toy. It can look quite brief and small with the be ye. And so it really can change a lot depending on what the word that comes after it. That introduces both a high level of calligraphic complexity or visual complexity. It also introduces font engineering challenges because as you're typing, the letters are changing their shape. And so we'll discuss that a little bit later on, but this is just to give an overview of the way that Nastaliq looks. Often Urdu readers, when they read a Nastaliq word, will read the shape of the word as much as they read the word itself, because they are so used to the specificity of shapes that each word makes because of the visual complexity of each visual complexity in the script style. So those are the two important things to remember whenever we think about Nastaliq. The other thing is, interestingly, Nastaliq, like I discussed earlier, when I was discussing all the different script styles, so each of the different script styles may be used for a different purpose. Within the Arabic script tradition, Nastaliq is often used as a ornamental kind of display text. So you will have that in miniature paintings. In contemporary Iran, you might have that as a film titles or an exhibition, an art exhibition. So you might have a title for an art exhibition or a coffee table book. That kind of like artistic production is often used in Nastaliq. Out of Pakistan is the only, or I would rather say Urdu is the only language that uses Nastaliq for both ornamental purposes, but also really mundane day-to-day paragraphs of text. So here in this image, you see it is this is beautifully calligraphed Persian poetry. It is from India from 1640, and that's in the Nastaliq script style, and that is what we will commonly see Nastaliq being used for. But here on the right-hand side is a scan of a how-to manual for a Singer sewing machine. So I think this is in the early 1975, I think this is. But yeah, it's just like, it's a very basic sewing machine manual, and it is all handwritten in Nastaliq, and that is unusual. And partly that's unusual because of what I explained earlier, that Nastaliq has a lot of visual complexity, so it's not often used for mundane day-to-day kind of items, except for Urdu where it is. Interestingly, for Urdu, language and script are very much inseparable. So linguists will often describe language as the spoken language as the communication of ideas through sound images, while the script is just the visual representation of language. So it is just the visible marks or the graphic representation. Script by itself holds no content. A script is only the graphic representation of language. That's really important and this kind of distinction that I'm making right now will be important to remember later as well, when we realize how often those distinctions are eroded when we think about Urdu. Here I put the word Nastaliq on the right-hand side in the Nastaliq style, and on the left-hand side in the Naskh style. So the Naskh style is quite commonly seen in Arab-speaking countries, so like I said, UAE, etc. While Nastaliq is used for Urdu. For a general Urdu reader, if I was to present them with any text typeset in the Naskh style, the instinct is always to think, oh, that's probably Arabic, even though the text might be in Urdu. But just the visual, the fact that it's not, the fact that Urdu is not in its typical style of Nastaliq is sometimes enough for an Urdu reader to misunderstand and consider at first glance that it's probably Arabic. Later on, like that, I've made a distinction between Arabic and Urdu. I think that's the Urdu and Nastaliq are also seen as one. If we look in contemporary India or contemporary Pakistan, you'll see a lot of these news coming out of India that Muslim Nastaliq shop signs have been taken down, or that kind of thing, where often just the visual representation of Nastaliq is considered to be some kind of like a strong Muslim identity marker in contemporary India. You'll see lots of these articles as well saying the death of the Urdu script, while what they really mean is that Nastaliq is difficult or not always seen online. And again, it's called the Urdu script. There's no such thing as the Urdu script, it's Nastaliq, but again, these things are often used interchangeably within common discourse. There's also a lot of emphasis on a lot of these words that get used. For example, here you have this tweet that says, just like other languages, Urdu needs to be presented in its original form. So there's a lot of sense that there is indeed an original form for Urdu, and that original form, the undiluted, pure, perfect form, is the Nastaliq form. We see this not just within conversations that Urdu speakers might have with each other, but also larger interactions that Urdu speakers make with any kind of technology. So this is a very popular campaign started by Mudassar Azimi, the social media campaign for Apple to implement the Nastaliq, Nastaliq font. Prior to this, if you chose Urdu as your default language in any kind of iOS device, it would come up within the Nas style, which is what I showed earlier. But since then, there was so much uproar and also like a little bit of discourse on how this Nas style is an Arab imperialist style, and we reject that, and Pakistanis want something that is purely Pakistani, which is the Nastaliq style. And so after a lot of social campaigning, Apple finally implemented Nastaliq, I think Noori Nastaleeq, which is a Nastaliq typeface, as the default typeface for reading Urdu, which means that if you choose Urdu in an iPhone, you don't have a choice. You have to read it in Nastaliq. And so there's all these ways that Urdu readers demand that identity be preserved in the kind of technological interfaces that they use. This is now, if I get to the story of how this particular, or the story of how why Nastaliq became so important to both a Pakistani and a Muslim identity. Lahori Nastaliq was designed by calligrapher Abdul Majid Parveen in 1928. Lahori, when I say Lahori Nastaliq, I make a distinction between the Nastaliq that was before 1928, which is like a more Persian, the canonical calligraphic Persian style of Nastaliq. And I'll explain the differences between the Lahori Nastaliq and Persian Nastaliq a little bit later. But this is just to speak a little bit about how language and script became important identity markers in pre-partition India. At the time that Sir Sayyid's two-nation theory is gathering momentum, there is a lot of shared culture, shared language between Muslim and Hindu communities in pre-partition India. Of course, Hindi and Urdu are also mutually intelligible languages. They share the same common lexicon and grammar. The greatest distinction between Urdu and Hindi is, of course, the written form, where Hindi is written often in Devanagari, which is a much more horizontal and has lots of like verticals. It's quite visually quite remarkably different than Nastaliq. And while this is happening, the script becomes a really important way of defining why Muslim identity or Muslim demands for a Muslim nation state are necessary and important. And so script becomes really important. Perhaps some of you will know who Muhammad Iqbal is. He is considered the national poet of Pakistan, a founding father, and extremely popular, extremely well-read. Even now in Pakistan, you will see his poetry on like roadside cafes, behind trucks. Like he's still extremely wide-read by the Pakistani populace. And at the time when he sees that Abdul Majid Parveen Rakam, who is the calligrapher, is modifying the version. I don't know if you've lost me. Oh no, I'm back. Sorry, I'm gonna go back. Yeah, at the time that Muhammad Iqbal recognizes that this calligrapher is doing something really interesting by adapting what is considered a Persian court style of script, which is the Nastaliq style, into something that is much more modern. He immediately latches onto that, and he declares that he will stop publishing poetry unless the calligrapher Majid Parveen Rakam publishes in the Nastaliq style. And that becomes very important because now suddenly everything that the Muslims of India are consuming is written in that particular style. And so again, the ideological demands of a separate nation state become infused, because if you're reading ideologically charged poetry within that style, it is much harder to separate the two. Yeah, so then this is one of the reasons why Lahori Nastaliq is identified not only within its communal identity of like Indians, but also religious identity, so Muslims in India. And now that is translated into a Muslim Pakistani identity. There's also interestingly a practical consideration behind the adaptation. So at the time, newspaper networks are flourishing in pre-partition India. Often political pamphlets, political material needs to be widely disseminated. And the Persian Nastaliq style, which is much more ornamental, much more has a higher contrast, is harder to print at very small sizes. Because if you're printing with something like lithography, and there is a legibility that you are compromising if the various strokes are lost in small sizes. So Muhammad Abdul Majid Parveen Rakam very cleverly adapts the traditional calligraphic Persian Nastaliq style into a much more graphic, much more modern style by making everything less contrasting. So there's a low contrast, and importantly, in the Persian Nastaliq style, the stress axis is very diagonal. So if you write a long sentence in the Persian Nastaliq style, you will see it kind of feels like it's lying down a little bit. There's a diagonality in the reading experience. And in Lahori Nastaliq, everything is very perpendicular. It's like just straight. This is more clearly seen in the alif, which is just a single line. If you see that, if you compare both the alifs together, you maybe see that more distinctly. But Allama Iqbal's son Javed Iqbal says that the verticality that Parveen Rakam implemented in the Lahori Nastaliq style was meant to echo the momentum of the Muslims in India asking for, demanding for a separate state. So there's a lot of, again, even in the design of the script, there's a lot of ideological undercurrents, a lot of like nation-state identities that are forming, even in the decisions made by calligraphers as they adapt it, and then by poets as they use it widely in their publications. So this this is in 1981 where we have the very first Nastaliq font, which is Noori Nastaleeq, what I will be sharing with you today, what the whole presentation is about. It's in 1981 that we have this font. Important to note that mechanized printing for newspapers, widely disseminated mechanized printing in newspapers, was available in the Arab-speaking world by 1960. We don't have that in Pakistan up until 1981. And when we finally have a Nastaliq style font that can be used instead of handwriting everything, this is considered a remarkable achievement. It is designed by Ahmed Mirza Jamil, who was a publisher before that, and because he was a publisher, he had direct experience about how difficult it was to publish Urdu books without a font, when everything had to be handwritten and then published. And so Pakistani government recognizes that achievement by awarding him a Tamgha-e-Imtiaz, which is a very high honor. Before he invents this font, before he designs this font, all newspapers in Pakistan are, up until 1981, are handwritten and then lithographed. When I first came across this, I was absolutely shocked that this was happening as late as 1981. So what would that would mean is that a room full of scribes, 12, 13 scribes, would sit every night and scribble all of the articles and newspaper essays. And often that would mean is sometimes there were mistakes, and then that would mean that the process of correcting those mistakes was much more cumbersome. And the output of each, the calligraphic hand of every scribe was also slightly different. So you had much greater variation in how each newspaper was handwritten. And of course, with regard, it was a very time-taking process. And so, yeah, it's only in 1981, after Noori Nastaleeq is created, that we finally have in Pakistan a newspaper that isn't first handwritten, which I think is kind of crazy. This is from the monotype recorder in 1981. This is when they announced to the world that we have this font. So Mirza Jamil is the person who designs this, and Monotype is the company that commissions the font. And Noori Nastaleeq is a font for proprietary software, so you can only use it in Monotype's laser comp, which is the machine that they use. do this. A lot of the language that any kind of article on Noori Nastaleeq that you will see across the years is a lot of like intense language. So there's words like revolution. There's a lot of spiritual undertones in the kind of advertisement that surrounds Noori Nastaleeq. I think that alone makes for a very interesting research topic. Like what is the language that people use to speak about the very first font that is available in Urdu for Urdu-speaking audiences. So yeah, lots of big fanfare, extremely exciting. Everyone is really excited and thrilled that we finally have this. So crap, it's sorry, this is a bit blurry, but my bad. Anyway, so this is the scan of the very first newspaper that gets printed with the Noori Nastaleeq. And what is really interesting about this is that on in the image that you can see, the right-hand column is text printed in the font, and the left-hand column is text that is handwritten. And at some point, you might think that's very unusual, because if they have a font, why are they still using the handwritten in parts of it? And of course, the reason why both of these columns are placed next to each other is so that because they really want to convince Urdu readers that, don't worry, this new font that we have looks exactly as beautiful, and it looks exactly the same as the handwritten version that you are so used to seeing. And this is even more critical because a couple of years ago, because prior to this, there have been many failed attempts at having a Nastaleeq font. One of the failed attempts was rejected by the Pakistani-speaking audience to such an extreme degree that the newspaper had to suspend its operations for a week and revert back to the handwritten version. So there were economic consequences to not getting the font correct. So Jung, which is the newspaper that uses this Noori Nastaleeq font, really goes out of its way to convince Urdu readers that don't worry, it looks exactly like the handwritten font, and they really do place these columns right next to each other. Another really interesting thing that I find about the advertisement that they publish in that first issue of Jung that uses the font is that the font is introduced by these beautiful calligraphed specimens that are done by Mirza Noor Ahmed, who is the father of Mirza Jamil, who is the designer of the font. And in that way, the newspaper is really laboring to make connections that, hey, this font is it's digital, mechanical, whatever, but it represents the same kind of calligraphic modes of expression that you as an Urdu reader are used to seeing. And so even though this is a big technological advancement, a big breakthrough for Urdu readers, this creation of a font, all of the language that is, and all of the kind of advertisement material that is coming out of it is very much focused around the same, calligraphic expressions, and I think that is something that carries forward even now within a modern Urdu reader's expectations, and I'll discuss that. One of the ways that I think that expectation still carries forward is if you pick up any Urdu newspaper. Again, as an Urdu reader, this is something that I took for granted. But when I'm at university, and my university has a large archive of global newspapers from around the world, and so as I was rifling through all of the newspapers and various scripts, I noticed that actually the Urdu newspaper is the only kind of newspaper that is literally saturated with calligraphic modes of expression that come from Persian and then Urdu lithographs. So there's almost like an unbroken connection between how we want to typeset design Urdu newspapers and how we want to read them, and the way that a reader in 16th century India or 19th century India was reading these newspapers. So one of the ways, and there are many, but we don't have time, so maybe I won't go into all of them, but one of the ways that you see these calligraphic modes of expression is I have marked, this is a scan of Jung newspaper. Jung is one of the most biggest newspaper in Pakistan, widely distributed and really like a household name, I would say. This is a headline, the main headline, and then a sub-headline of the section of the newspaper. And here I have marked in red many different diacritical marks. So in Urdu, a lot of the vowels that we have are expressed not through consonants, but through diacritical marks. So the a, e, u sound often come as the diacritics of Zer, Zabar, Pesh that perhaps some of you might already be familiar with. When we write Urdu, we don't often need to put these diacritical marks, because as Urdu readers, we often know where the stress is, and so we read without having the marks. All of the marks that you can see here are not meant to be read. They are all ornamental, which means that every time an Urdu newspaper is designed, and of course, within a newspaper environment, time is very precious. But yet they have hired somebody whose only job is to make ornamental the headlines. And so I think I counted at some point, I think this is about 100 just on this page. It's a very large number of ornamental marks that are placed individually one by one. There's no automated way of doing it. And one of the reasons why that happens is because we are used to balancing space out. We are used to seeing Nastaliq in this kind of balanced, where any kind of empty space has a ornamental mark. It's the way that Persian manuscripts were also designed and written. And so this newspaper is both a modern document, but also representative of historical documents. And I think that's really quite interesting. And again, you could just do a whole session just on analyzing the calligraphic modes of expression within contemporary Urdu newspapers, because there are so many. This is from the newspaper Medina in 1915. Again, you can see here I've zoomed in the masthead. So here the word Medina, and again you can see here everywhere all of the kind of empty spaces between the letters are filled in with these like ornamental marks. And if you go further, like I think last month at my university, we were doing a collection archive session in which I saw early 19th century Persian newspaper, which the heading of it was designed so similar to this Urdu newspaper from like 2023 that it was remarkable that as Urdu readers, we are so historical ways of reading are still so legible to us that they actually, if you designed an Urdu newspaper outside of these ways, I think people would be surprised and people would be like, that's not what we expected to see, because again, it's so common to read in this way. I also, interestingly, here in these newspapers, you'll see a lot of pan-Islamic references. So you'll see Medina was obviously the holy city in Saudi Arabia, where Prophet Muhammad lived as well for a while. And again, these pan-Islamic references tie quite closely Nastaliq within both a broad Muslim identity and a communal identity within South Asia. And again, you will see that again and again in so many different documents, lithographs and print documents from the region. This is to speak a little bit about the peculiarities of how Noori Nastaleeq was designed. So often when I was explaining the difference between language and script, I spoke about how script is very much the graphic representation. Script itself holds no ideas. It is just the visible marks of language. And many contemporary, when we design typefaces within contemporary technological environments as well, it is very much an analysis of visual forms. And so what it looks graphically is kind of the main parameter of how we design and engineer these fonts. Interestingly, because of the complexity of Nastaliq, so when I spoke about how often the letters change form as you type them, because of that complexity, Mirza Jamil's strategy of designing this font was a very unconventional strategy. So instead of just saying, okay, this is what the Nastaliq letter forms look like, so we're going to design it, of course, he had the added engineering challenges of how do you preempt what shape each alphabet, each letter is going to take as the person is typing those words out, because as he's typing them out, the words need to change shape appropriately to represent the letter. So instead of going through just a very basic visual route, he chose to do a linguistic analysis of the Urdu language. So this means that he indexed all the different word combinations that are present in Urdu at the time that he was designing the font, so in 1980. The font here is a scan of a sample of the digital corpus from Nemet's book, Arabic Typemaking in the Machine Age. And here you can see that the font has a list of 8 letter combinations, then a list of 2-character ligatures, 3 characters. So there's basically just a list in a very complicated, very extensive listing of all the different letter combinations that exist in Urdu in 1981. For those who are unfamiliar what a ligature is just a single glyph or single image combination of various letters. So a ligature could be here, as you can see, sh, b, y, that's a ligature. And in Nastaliq fonts in Pakistan, it is very common to say that my font is a character-based font or a ligature-based font. And that distinction, again, is the historical distinction, because the very first font that we had was a ligature-based font. This kind of terminology within contemporary typeface design is non-existent, because it is assumed that all fonts are character-based fonts, in the sense that they do not have, the entire font does not rely on these word combinations. So if you were to open this Noori Nastaleeq in Glyphs, which is a common popular software for designing fonts, you will see that it has 25,000 glyphs. And that means that it is a very heavy font. It is, I think the font file, if you were to use it online, is like 8 MB alone, just the font file, which again is very remarkably heavy, which slows down websites. And, that's a problem we can discuss later. But this is just to say that the design of this font is from a linguistic analysis, not just a visual analysis. What that has meant for those of us who grew up in Pakistan in the 80s and who use this font is that this font, because this font was made on an analysis of the Urdu language as it existed in 1980, if this font is not very good at typing out words that are uncommon, words that are either words that were invented much after 1981, or they are transliterated words. So anything that exists that did not exist as within the Urdu language in 1980, it is quite difficult to type that out. So here I've written the word cappuccino coffee. On the right-hand side is a new font designed by Borna Izadpane, released by Google. It's called Gurzar, and it has cappuccino coffee written. And then on the left-hand side, I've got Noori Nastaliq, the same word cappuccino coffee. And here you can see that all the nuktas are kind of clashing with each other. There's a little bit of word breakage here as well happening. So the ch, ya, the n, w, there are all these kind of like breakages that are happening. And that means obviously that the word is very difficult to read. And one of the ways that you can see that even now, so for example, if you were to pick up a newspaper in Pakistan, Jung, and if it had a technical term, so if it had a term like algorithm, or if it had a term like information technology, you will see that often that term is written in English. So the entire column would be in Urdu, but just that one single term will be written in English. And Zeerak Ahmed, who is the creator of the Urdu keyboard Matan Saz, writes about this really well. And he says that if you were to pick up any kind of textbook, mathematics, economics, whatever, you will find that actually the entirety of that textbook is available in Urdu. But any kind of material, curriculum, syllabus, any kind of, written on information technology, computing, software, that kind of thing, is not possible to find in Urdu, because it is so difficult to type out new words that were made after 1981 because of obviously advancements of technology. It's very hard to type, it's not possible to type them out in Noori Nastaleeq. And one of the inferences that Zeerak draws from that is that, he asks, is that the reason why often we don't have words for these new language for new technologies such as algorithms and UX, etc. Because if you can't type out new words, why would you even bother making them? So often in Urdu we resort to transliteration really commonly. We resort to using English words within Urdu, and obviously the reasons for that are greater than just the font. But the font, is something that is not spoken about often enough. We don't recognize how deeply the way that we type and the font that we use to represent our languages can have an impact on the language itself, and that is particularly true for Urdu. The other way that the font both the font and the expectations of Urdu readers, so when I spoke about how Urdu readers often expect any kind of Urdu document to reference those complicated, sophisticated, beautiful, ornamental ways of calligraphic expression, what that means is that often when we want to read on the internet, we expect the documents that we read online to look exactly the way that the documents look in print. And for that reason, Urdu's data economy is very much built on images. So if you were to Google Urdu poetry, if you were to, a lot of the material that you see in the Urdu language is basically JPEGs. Even here right now, so Nawai Waqt, this is a screenshot of the website of Nawai Waqt. Like Jung, it's also a very popular and important newspaper in Pakistan. And if you go to their website, they actually have scans of the print version of their newspaper online. So they will scan it, and then here every story will be hyperlinked. And so the main interface of interacting even with an online newspaper is through its print representation. And again, that's because Pakistani readers are used to reading Urdu in specific ways. If you were to click on for example, here I've highlighted here, if you were to click on one of these stories, you would land onto this page, which is again, has the scanned headline of that very highly decorative headline. A clear problem with this is that anytime that you want to research anything on Urdu, so for example, say you're a researcher working in history, or any kind of, actually, like you're working on any kind of like political party, the development of a political party in Pakistan, and if you wanted to look up news articles for that, you would be in a big problem, because you would have to read every single article to know if it's like useful for you or not. You couldn't just search for words in the Urdu newspapers archive, because every Urdu newspaper is relying on images instead of HTML text that is searchable, browsable, indexable. So that is actually a really big problem that Urdu researchers face. It takes much longer to get research done in Urdu, because the researcher has to spend a lot more energy and time actually reading through, instead of just being able to have keywords that they're searching through. Another reason why we continue to have why we continue to often resort to English is that the technology that we use for representing Urdu are very well suited to representations of English or the Latin script. And as Urdu readers who are so used to the particular font, we are Noori Nastaleeq, and both the particular ways of reading, we often don't want to make compromises, so we'll continue typesetting things in Nastaleeq. But as technologies change, there are certain decisions. Either we work on the technologies to make space for the multiplicity of expressions that are natural to us, or we recognize that then there's something needs to basically give. Often when we typeset any kind of Nastaleeq website, we will use strategies that are common for using English documents. So the use of bold and italics is very common for English, but actually historically in Urdu, we don't have bold and italics. If you apply an italic tag through CSS on your web browser, it'll usually break up the Urdu word. And so there are many different challenges to reading Urdu online, one of which is obviously just using strategies from the Latin script without recognizing that our scripts require a different tag and perhaps different interventions within existing technology, because the technology as it exists is myopic and does not serve our populations. Yes, another clear problem that we have whenever we use Noori Nastaleeq or any kind of Nastaleeq font online is that Nastaleeq is a stacked script, so often it has a greater height than the Latin script, and that means we need to have greater space between sentences. In typography, we call that line height. And often what you see that the kaf, the ascender of the kaf here, as you can see where I've outlined in the red circle, will bump into the sentences that are just on top of the word. Again, common, makes it difficult to read, makes it cumbersome, slow reading, also unpleasant to look at, looks ugly. Because Noori Nastaleeq was made for the particular software, but a particular machine, monotype laser comm. The versions of Noori Nastaleeq that we have currently in use are pirated versions. That means that a lot of the ways that you would deal with font sizing, a lot of the ways that you would deal with all of the other kinds of ways that you put font online have not really been looked at. And you'll have a document in which you would think that the larger font size means that it's a heading, but actually it's just a list here. You can see number 8 is much larger than number 7. But in terms of hierarchy, both 7 and 8 in this list are exactly the same. These are just things that make it very difficult for an Urdu reader to read online. And again, that means we resort to English, or we decide to have Urdu images instead. This is of particular interest to me because there's a lot of elements that go within reading Urdu online that need specific attention. So any of the UX elements that you have, so what happens when you hover on something? What does a button look like? These are very, very difficult to do in the Lahori Nastaliq style. Because here you can see that I've typeset 2 buttons. One is in a common Naskh font that is used popularly within the Arab world, and you can see that it fits quite nicely within a button because it's all kind of horizontal and flat, while Urdu, which has a the Urdu Lahori Nastaliq, the one that we use for Urdu, has a diagonality, so it often juts out, which makes it much more difficult to typeset within like standard widths and sizes of buttons. At the bottom here, you can see that I've had a little, it's a zoom up of my Chrome browser. When you hover on a tab, and sometimes when you hover on a tab, it tells you what website you're on. So if you hover on BBC, I think now they've changed the font actually. So, but if you used to hover on BBC, the English is very, very clear. You can immediately tell, oh, it's news, latest news, breaking news, BBC. But in Urdu, because the font Urdu is much taller, so it has to be reduced in font size. It is much more difficult to read. And I think if I was to make one summary, it's that constantly in Urdu, instead of thinking about the ways in which our technology is lacking, we often think about how can we squeeze, fit, manipulate, and compromise to fit in existing technologies. And that's a beautiful segue into this project, Matansaz, which is a breakthrough Urdu keyboard which reimagines what a technology that actually serves Urdu-speaking populations could look like. It recognizes that Urdu is read in multiple ways by various Urdu-speaking audiences, that they are not homogeneous. And so it offers many different ways of typing Urdu. But an essential thing that is really fantastic about this keyboard is that it separates Urdu letters into their 3 basic layers. So in Urdu, we have the basic shape, which is called rasam. Then we have all of the different nuktas that get added, which is called ijaz, and then you have the diacritical markings. And when you make these 3 layers, it makes it very easy to type out in using this keyboard. Also, the keyboard has a fantastic auto type feature, which means you can just start typing a word and it'll suggest to you. That is powered by a very important text corpus called makhzan. Again, you can read up more in these projects online, and you'll get a much better description and explanation of these projects. But this is just to say that there are people working now and imagining, instead of thinking about how can we compromise Urdu to fit in existing technologies, they're thinking about how can we expand the scope of existing technologies to serve us. Another way that happens, Matansaz is a much more it's a very formal project that has a formal output. But if I look at all the informal ways that software hacks within Urdu speaking, Urdu reading markets happens, is this is a image of a poster that you will see in any kind of Pakistani major city. and just on the walls, on the streets, very popular, considered like just very basic with a texture of an urban environment. And they are extremely densely designed using historical calligraphic practices, but they are all designed within contemporary software. So the software, me as a designer working in the UK, I'll often use like the Adobe suite, none of which, like Illustrator, InDesign, none of which are very good at typesetting Urdu. And there are many different challenges for that. Word spacing is an important one of them, but essentially they're just really bad. If I wanted to print a whole Urdu book just using InDesign, I would be taking a lot of time and energy, and often the output would not be as sophisticated as an Urdu book typeset by a desktop publisher, designer in Pakistan. And so the softwares that they use are they're outdated software. So for example, I think this poster was designed on Corel Draw, which is a software that you will not encounter in design studios here in the UK or North America. And these softwares are adapted to suit their own purposes. So often the designers working in these small shops will write specific scripts and hacks within the software to facilitate this kind of complex print output that they have. Yeah, so that's the end of it, I guess. Just speaking a little bit about how Noori Nastaleeq has played both a very integral role in the way that we finally are able to publish Urdu books, and I think that you cannot underestimate the impact of quick and efficient publishing. But also the downside of that is that has had important impacts on both the way that Urdu has shaped as a language, the way Urdu readers often Romanize and transliterate words, and the Urdu reading audience's relationship with existing technology, specifically web browsers. Yeah, thanks.
This was a very insightful presentation, and I think also it neatly summarizes the goal of the series as well, which is understanding how something as insignificant but something as ubiquitous as font can have far-reaching consequences on something as profound as language itself. So I think the Q&A box has been open, so just keep your questions coming in. Before we get started on the audience questions, I'd like to open with one of my own. With such deficient and scant platforms and tools for functional, let alone artistic typography, what is the state of the local print economy of desktop publishers? Like, how do they provide services, and how do they compete within what in theory seems like a homogeneous market? Because you said there's just one typeface. So how do DTP operators differentiate their services and compete for clients, and how do clients then in turn demand different services to distinguish their own personal brands or personal aesthetic?
I hate to generalize, and I know that in my talk I've often spoken about Urdu readers and Urdu speaking communities as some kind of like homogenous community, and of course, that's not entirely true. But if I do just look at the popularity of Noori Nastaleeq, then it does tell me that there is some underlying like shared understanding of what Urdu should look like and how Urdu should be read. If I consider that the popularity of Noori Nastaleeq is evidence of that. And so I suppose I don't even know if the question is directly applicable on desktop publishers. Like, I don't even know if they are indeed looking to be distinct, or if they're thinking that the reason that their services are valuable is because they offer something that in terms of visual identity or visual output that is different from their neighbor next door. But in fact, it seems like the more adept you are at representing Urdu within these traditions of calligraphic manuscript ways of understanding Urdu, the more competent you are at delivering on those fronts, the more in demand you are. And often when I spend time in Karachi, in print shops and in small design shops, I notice that the client will come to the designer with it'll either be a scrap of paper, so it'll just have like the content, And the conversation that the designer and the client will have will not be a conversation on like, this is my graphic, this is what my brand is, and that's what and it'll be some kind of conversation on like colors or whatever. But a lot of the times the client is relying on a shared understanding of like local culture, and he knows that the designer just has to deliver on that shared understanding. And the designer will not ask too many questions about what it's what kind of font do you want, whatever. It's often very much like, I suppose I should spend more time in those to understand what are those unsaid, subtle kind of like communications that are happening between the designer and client. So that's one thing. I think that maybe is not a question that's entirely relevant, because Urdu readers often read in these like canonical ways. And then I hope, does that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, it's just basically a very different paradigm itself. It's not
correct. Yeah,
it's one of competence and not necessarily one of like the traditional sort of competition as we perceive it in the design sphere.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
I'm picking questions of the Q&A box. Okay, I'll just pick the first one. As you said, Noori Nastaleeq is a ligature-based font. Would that mean that the time and effort required to design a Nastaleeq-based font would be exponentially higher than the effort taken to design a character-based font for, say, Latin? And I mean, do you know that, just to expand on this question, do you know how much time it would take just to benefit the
it's so very interesting actually. So when I say the Noori Nastaleeq is a ligature-based font, that's an anomaly. It is because it is a ligature-based font that I discussed all of the problems and the inadequacies that we face now as Urdu users. And but that doesn't mean that contemporary Nastaliq fonts that are being designed, so for example Gulzar, the one that I have in my presentation as well, is any easier to design, because I think, as far as my understanding is, the challenges are not just on the design front, so not just representing the visual complexity and the diagonality of the letters, but it's very much a font engineering challenges as well. Because the time and time again, the problems that most Urdu typeface designers who just want to design a Nastaliq font face is that the nuktas will often clash with each other. And so developing font engineering kind of systems in which there is no situation in which nuktas, when I say nuktas, I mean the dots, in case that's not clear. So all the dots that get used in Arabic script. So that's a very important. So that means you can type, potentially, ideally, you should be able to type absolutely any combination of words, letters in Urdu without having the nuktas clash into each other. So that's a problem that continuously typeface designers face, and that's a font engineering problem that also requires a very close collaboration between font engineer and font designer. And so it does take, it's much more time consuming, correct? A lot of testing needs to be done for that.
And are there standard sort of corpus of text used for this texting? Is there a particular process, standardized process for this testing that you're aware of?
No, it seems no, because it seems like there have not been actually, if I that many Nastaliq fonts, so I can really count on my hands maybe the Nastaliq fonts that are available in the market, out of which I can probably count only maybe like 2 that get widely used in Pakistan, and then another 2 that get used outside of Pakistan. And so, yeah, sorry, Adarsh, will you repeat what the question was? I lost my train of thought.
No, is what I meant to ask is, like, is there any particular process, standardized process?
Yeah. So because there are not that many Nastaliq fonts, and because it is such an understudied research area, I know that there is no standard way of testing. So for example, Gulzar had a very different process in which a lot of software was required to make sure the nuktas would not clash. I know that another font that Borna is working on right now has a very different way of testing. So there doesn't seem to be a standardized way, and it's very much on the kind of design and engineering strategies that the partnership or that the font designer will take for that particular project that then determines the way that it's tested.
Right. The next question is by Bakar. Is there a major reason why Nastaliq flourished in the Pakistan Indian subcontinent, or was it primarily due to the Mughals?
Well, Persian was the language of instruction or the language of the government during Mughals. When the British came to India, they replaced that with English in all of the courts, except for Urdu was used in all the vernacular courts. So in a way, in terms of like the local languages or whatever, Urdu was kind of taken to replace Persian. And of course, because Urdu is written in the script style, in the Arabic script, it was and because it was such a direct replacement of Persian, it continued using the same Persian Nastaliq style for Urdu up until 1928, when the Persian Nastaliq style was modified to the Lahori Nastaliq style, which is what we see now in Pakistan.
Another question that's more about Urdu and its relationship to Nastaliq. Could you elaborate on the relationship between Urdu Nastaliq type and the daily handwritten Urdu used regularly in Pakistan, as well as any relations to modern art, pop art? Yeah.
I remember when I was in my university classroom, and all of us students were like doing some kind of like essay, like some kind of research situation, and we took a break, and there turned out to be there's a couple of Arabic speakers from various countries within the classroom, and so we all were like, okay, let's figure out how do you write, because we all share the same script, but and of course, like the Egyptian student in the classroom hand wrote with very much within the and Ruqa style, even though it was just very general, basic handwriting. The Kuwaiti girl wrote in the Naskh style, and of course, I wrote in the Nastaliq style. So the point is that the style that is most common and popular within the region is often then the style that is imitated within our very basic handwriting as well. So as Pakistanis, I think most of us do write within the Nastaliq, and an easy way that you can spot that is often when we write, we have the same diagonality in our letters, in our words, as opposed to when an Arabic speaker writes and they have much more horizontal kind of word formation. And so that's a really clear relationship between the daily handwritten Urdu. I'm not sure when you mean modern art, pop art, maybe they want to elaborate what they mean by that.
Yeah, we can wait on the elaboration on that question. Next question from Neha. How does the Rekhta website work? Is it also image-based?
That's a really good question. No, it used to be image-based and now it isn't. But the way the Rekhta website is encoded is much, I think because they want to copyright so much information. So the way that they have encoded the Urdu words is much more opaque and much more tight. So, for example, even if the Rekhta website, in all instances, it also has nuktas clashing. It has errors that I see here and there. But even if I was to say that perhaps all of those errors are not there, and it is a good example, it would not be something that you can use for multiple kinds of websites, for like a newspaper website in which a person using their browser screen sometimes want to narrow their screen and enlarge it, or if they're using an iPad, they want to use it in portrait format, landscape. There's a lot of like intense use scenarios that the Rekhta website would not fit well on with that. I think, I'm not sure, I gotta find out, I've forgotten, I did research what font they use, but yeah.
The next question by Vasudha. How can non-Latin scripts push for making UI design follow typographic traditions as opposed to fitting in the Western models that push or homogenize aesthetic? Do you think there's a possibility to push the boundaries of UI design to serve different scripts?
I mean, yes, always yes. The answer is always yes. How? I don't know, but the answer, I always operate from absolutely any kind of technological gap. It is possible, but it's a very interesting question. In my PhD project, I use Lahori Nastaliq as a case study because of its specific complexities that it makes for a very good script to have as a case study, to then solve all the other or some of the shared problems that other global scripts might have. So the premise of my PhD is that the intention is that I would want to at the end of the PhD, there is my outcome is a web framework that looks at how any kind of non-Latin script can be used in sophisticated, complex ways, and that includes UI design. The way that we expect to see in English. So it's a practice-based PhD, and the entire motivation of doing this PhD is so that someone could fund me to problem solve how to make UI frameworks for global scripts.
Have you seen examples where you've seen a slightly different paradigm just for the Nastaliq script, like for Urdu on the web? Like, for example, just a simple thing like the box you showed, the buttons, like the padding on the button, just like more mindfully designed. Have you seen examples of those?
Often, I mean, unfortunately, no. Sometimes you'll see a marginally better design, but that would be in Urdu, but that would be using Naskh as a script style and not Nastaliq. Again, you know, I mean, like, I've only just started my research. I'm sure there are some. I very much intend to find them, but for whatever that I have done, the research that I've done so far, I have not been able to find good references. The references that are available that are good are all in print, and so part of the problem solving that I do in my PhD is I look at what print models are available and how to translate those print models onto web interfaces.
Right. Okay. The next question by Kalapi. He apologizes for the loaded question. I'm interested in the future of text infrastructure in South Asian writing systems. For the last 4 decades, a small group of individuals and corporations, for better or for worse, have been the decision makers on how things work for tens or hundreds of millions of people. Do you have any insights on how new infrastructure can be more democratized?
No, thanks, Kalapi. That's a great question. That's something that I often think about a lot as well. I would have to say one of the ways that Urdu is, again, interesting to study is because Urdu readers resisted for a very long time this small group of individual or corporations to decide how things should work for Urdu. So, for example, when I said that in the 1960s, mechanized printing was already widely available for Arab-speaking audiences, it was because generally Arab-speaking audiences had recognized that it was extremely important for them to have mass printing. And that meant that they would have to compromise on some of the visual complexity of the script. So the current typefaces that you often see in like newspapers in Egypt, etc., is what amongst type designers we might call it a simplified Arabic. So it is a simplification of type forms so that it is possible to use metal type or other kinds of like typesetting platforms and softwares. And it has meant that often the general Arab reader does not realize that the form of the Arabic script that they are reading is a compromised, or I would say simplified form of it. But if you compare that with Urdu-speaking audiences, they actually rejected monotype and linotype. Both had agents in constant correspondence with Pakistani publishers, Pakistani newspapers. At one point, I think in the 1960s, Monotype was willing to make £100,000 investment into the development of a Nastaliq font. And every time these projects were made and then they were tested on the Urdu reading audiences, it was always like, this is not good enough. We reject this Nastaliq font. So there are many Nastaliq fonts that were made up until 1981, but they were never rolled out within Urdu-speaking communities because they were all rejected, because they were not as beautiful, as complex and sophisticated as the handwritten Nastaliq that they were used to seeing and reading. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing, in Pakistan, I can't speak about other kinds of other places, but in Pakistan, I know that there is actually a lot of interest and activity on developing local technologies and local Nastaliq typefaces. But what happened, and one of them, for example, is Meher Type, and they have a beautiful Nastaliq font called Meher Nastaliq, and it's a father and son duo, and they literally work from inside their home, and they make these like incredible typefaces for Quran and for Nastaliq, etc. But often that production is like locked within local markets, like they have no visibility for international markets. And because I'm also very interested in this question that you've asked, I often think about what would that look like? What could their relationship to broader international type markets look like that didn't involve these like corporations as the middleman? I don't know what the answer is, but I know that it needs to be answered.
Are there any governmental organizations that are aiding in this purpose, at least within Pakistan, to just maybe like enable better bureaucracy, at least like just printing documents and such ephemera?
No. I think this one time we had a little bit of government funding for Meher type through a university, so not even directly government funding, but that's just the one time. And often I've noticed that whenever the government needs to update a document, so for example, a document exists in Urdu, and often, like I spoke with the marriage certificate example, often they are handwritten and photocopied documents. When the Pakistani government wants to update it, they'll just type the whole thing out in English instead. And that means that the latest of that is I saw a police registration form. And so often if a person is coming from interior Sindh, interior Punjab, that's not accessible to them. And then again, that really dramatically, disenfranchises communities from accessing information and important information, because the government is not really interested in looking at this.
Just to follow up on that, so are we seeing some sort of like a mass exodus from the script and the language to English? And is that also becoming the language of bureaucracy in Pakistan because of its
English is a language of the government, but English with Urdu, so often there's quite common stuff. For example, court proceedings will happen in English, etc. So that inevitably means that a lot of the documents we produce are in English. And I would say that this kind of is specifically, you see that within like informal digital spaces. So you see that within like text messages, Instagram, that kind of stuff, where people are using Romanized Urdu more and more frequently. So for example, if I was to go to a desktop publisher or, vinyl sticker designer in Karachi, who I know does not speak either English or Urdu very well, they might be Baloch or they might be Sindhi, and then, but the text messages that I receive from them are in Romanized Urdu, which is Urdu in the Latin script. But of course, Romanized Urdu has no standardized way of spelling. So even if we were to say that, okay, a lot of us have shifted, and so some information is available in Romanized Urdu, so you can search through it, the truth is that there's no standardized spelling. So if you're trying to search for something in Urdu, you have to try sometimes 5 different variations of that spelling to hit at the right one, to get the search result you are looking for. And that's a problem as well.
Okay. Before we get to the last, there's a few more questions that popped by. Okay, so another question by Bakar. What are the other Nastaliq fonts that are widely used currently in and out of Pakistan? And just to extend that question, is there like a public sort of database that you have, so like people can just sort of browse to that and see for themselves?
You mean a public database of available fonts?
Of just available fonts, or is there anything like this that
I don't know if there's a database. I can bookmark this as something to like really do a little bit more digging around. I haven't come across a database. I only know from personal experience of designing and researching what kinds of fonts are in popular use. So other than Noori Nastaleeq, we have Fairs Nastaliq, which is very popularly used specifically for the calligraphic posters that I showed briefly in my presentation. That's the one that they use a lot. We have Meher Nastaliq, which is often used for web browsers. It's a very light font. It's a very competent font, very efficient. So often they use for web browsers. And then we have a couple of others, but again, honestly, it's also very hard to find proper versions of these fonts. A lot of times, like even the version of Noori Nastaleeq that I have is a pirated version, because after Monotype's laser comp, it was made for InPage, which is a Urdu design word processing page maker software, amazingly Indian, originally made by Indian software producers. And so a lot of even if I was to tell you that other than these 4 fonts, there are another 4 fonts, they're only pirated versions which function well in certain softwares and don't function well in others. And it's very much like a hemorrhaging, because they're not, there's no font agency that releases these fonts and you can buy them. Lahori Nastaleeq is available for free, and that's a great font if you want to use that.
Yeah.
MEHR, Meher.
MEHR.
Yeah.
Okay.
MEHR.
Barira has another question. Is Noori Nastaliq also the type used in India?
Great question, Marita. I wish someone would give me a visa to go research in India. I would love to. But I do know that actually a lot of my books, which are published in Noori Nastaleeq, are printed in Delhi. And so a lot of my Urdu books are printed in Delhi, actually, both the lithographs, facsimiles, and also because I know that in-page, I know that Noori Nastaleeq was copyrighted for InPage, which is a design software that is developed in India. Then I know for a fact then that I infer that then it must be a commonly used font in India as well.
And I'm guessing this one is the last question. Again, one more by Kalapi. How popular and accessible is Decotype's Tasmeem?
It isn't. You can't use that as a plugin for InDesign anymore. The way you used to be able to use that, even before Tasmeem is a Iranian plugin, I believe, and before it was still expensive. Like I think it was like a couple of $100, but you could potentially plug that in with InDesign and use it. But you can't anymore. Adobe InDesign has, I think it's HarfBuzz, because of HarfBuzz that they use, that you can't use Decotype Tasmeem anymore. But it used to be really good. The books that I've seen typeset and that use Decotype Tasmeem are beautiful. But it's sad you don't have it anymore.
On that sad note, though, but lovely talk. And yeah, I'd like to just thank everyone for attending this. I feel like this has been like quite a lively Q&A session. Yeah, thanks a lot, Abira. And thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you for everyone for showing up and asking such great questions.
Yeah. It's good night from where I am, and have a nice day to you, Abira.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thanks, Adarsh. Bye.